For the last couple of years, the Sony FX3 has been a go-to mirrorless video camera for so many shooters. But now Panasonic just dropped the S1 II, and on paper it actually beats the FX3 in a lot of key areas. So the question I have is, does it just look good on a spec sheet, or can it actually take the crown in real world use? Right, let's get straight into it. Lumix on the left and Sony on the right. The first thing that jumps out to me is just how similar both these are in terms of colour. If you look just behind me to the left, you can see the Lumix is a bit more lifted and has a bit more information on the ground than in those trees. Here we start to see a few more differences. The grass on the Lumix to me looks a little bit more saturated, maybe more denser and rich, punching into 300%, and just as we expect, the 6K sensor from the Lumix has noticeably more detail. What I will say here though is that 4K and 6K is normally much closer in detail than what we are seeing here, so it's pretty impressive from the Lumix. A tricky shot here for any camera, and not to sound like a broken record, but just look how similar the images from these two cameras are. I honestly think the average viewer, especially someone who's not deep into cameras, would not even be able to tell the difference. Both are handling the highlights in a very similar way, and the colour palette looks really close. The only real difference I can spot once again is there's a tad more contrast in the Lumix. I grabbed this shot of this piece of art with testing colours in mind, and it really does show how similar the colour palettes are from these cameras. If you look at the top section, the Lumix leans a little bit more blue, while the Sony pushes a bit more purple, but we are really pixel peeping here. Pulling up the vector scope also tells a similar story. Swiping back and forth here, you can see it's just that blue tone area that is pushing between purple and blue, and all the other colours are kinda in the same zone with just slight differences in saturation. Let's jump into some 4K 100 frames per second footage, and at first glance, looking at the full frame shots here, both look really similar. But when we punch in by 300%, you'll notice now the tables have turned and we are seeing slightly more detail on the Sony. This is likely because the Sony is using a native 4K sensor, while the Lumix has its 6K sensor and has to downsample to 4K while reading all that data at 100 frames per second. There is also a slight difference in crop. The Sony crops in at 1.1 times, while the Lumix has slightly worse crop at around 1.24 times. I did my best here to try and show the difference in the crop, but as the cameras are mounted side by side, it's not a perfect comparison. One extra advantage for the Sony is that it can play its 100 frames and 120 frames back in slow motion right in camera. Where on the S1 II, when you go into S&Q, there is no 100 frames, it maxes out at 60. Meaning you have to slow down your 100 and 120 frames later in post-production. This may not matter to everybody, but sometimes it can be really helpful to review your super slow motion shot right in camera to know if you've nailed it or you need to go again. And lastly, the AF when it comes to 100 plus frames per second. This is the first ever Lumix full frame camera that has phase detect AF when shooting above 100 frames per second. And this is a massive step forward. But in the tests I did here, while the Lumix has definitely improved, it still falls slightly behind where the Sony is at. On the back of the camera, you only have a box on the Lumix, so no subject tracking for eye and face, where on the FX3, it keeps eye and face tracking. None of these two cameras kept 100% focus here, but a lot more of the footage from the Sony is in focus compared to the Lumix. So between all those small advantages compounding the slightly more detail, better AF and S&Q playback, I would say this is an easy win for the FX3 when it comes to high frame rate shooting. That said, the Lumix does deliver some really beautiful slow motion here, and most people would find it totally fine. Let's compare IBIS. This first test here is just the physical IBIS in camera, so no digital enhancement whatsoever. I think the Lumix is slightly better here, but the Sony also does a very good job. I honestly think the FX3 as IBIS system is slightly underrated, as people discuss and talk about it like it's weak, but most of the time it does a really solid job. Now here are both cameras in their max stabilization mode, so this is physical IBIS plus software. The Lumix does crop in a little bit more in its high mode, but in return you get super stable footage. This looks almost gimbal-like. Now let's talk AF. Honestly, I could make a whole video breaking the AF systems down in these two cameras, but for the sake of everybody's time, here's a quick version of my findings from my tests. If you are tracking people and faces, both cameras are excellent, even when under and over exposing. Where the Sony pulls ahead though is non-subject tracking, so when you just tap on an object on the back of the touchscreen and the little focus box will just grab onto it, I find this super reliable when it comes to Sony cameras. But the Lumix does a better job when it comes to tracking subjects. It is now packed with AI modes, probably the most out of any camera, and they are all genuinely really good. And in this new camera, they've added another AI mode. It's called Urban Sports, and it's for tracking fast-moving silhouettes of people doing stuff like BMX, skating, dancing, parkour. You get the idea. Right, let's sum this up. Neither of them are perfect. Both are very usable. I don't think at this point, when it comes to AF, there is a reason to choose one camera over the other, as they have now got so close and they are both just tools that you have to work with their trade-offs and advantages. Let's get into everyone's favourite subject, rolling shutter. Quick note before we get started though is I've turned the shutter angle way up. This reduces motion blur and allows us to see when swinging the camera around, but just know in real world use there'd be much more motion blur, would hide the rolling shutter, and the results would be much closer together. We will start in 4K versus 4K, both cameras in 50 frames per second to get the fastest possible readout. So what I see here is the Sony is definitely faster. It's not a huge gap, but it is noticeable if you're going to pan this extremely fast. Panasonic have not released any official numbers to any of the testers as it stands, but when this video goes online, someone online probably has. Knowing that the FX3 sits around 8 or 9 milliseconds, my educated guess here would be around 11, 12 or 13 milliseconds, but take that with a pinch of salt. Here is 6K in the Lumix versus 4K again in the Sony. Both 50 frames per second. The good news for the Lumix here is it does not look like the gap has gotten much bigger, if any bigger at all. I would guess that going from 4K to 6K inside the Lumix makes very little difference to readout speed, and that is what we are seeing. It is also worth noting that I have dynamic range boost turned off here in the Lumix, as that can make rolling shutter worse. That is not to be confused with the dynamic range expansion that lives inside the S1 or II. Now this is dynamic range boost that we have seen before in the GH7, so how that affects rolling shutter, I'm not 100% sure. I need to do more testing. Now let's talk about battery life, and while we're here we may as well discuss overheating. So I set both cameras with same lens, same settings, auto ISO, filming my iPad screen whilst running Netflix, so there was kind of constantly changing settings and chasing focus, all that sort of stuff. The Lumix managed a really impressive 2 hours and 11 minutes, while the Sony managed also a very impressive 1 hour and 57 minutes. Both completed and finished off their files, shut the cameras down without anything getting corrupt, which is great to see. This actually really impressed me, just because from all my tests, I can't actually remember the Sony FX3 losing a battery life test, and the Lumix has an EVF, a 6K sensor, a load more features, and it still managed to pip it just by a little bit, which is really impressive. In the real world though, the difference probably only equals like one extra battery swap, which is not that much of a big difference. So I would just say that both of these cameras have excellent battery life. As for overheating, if you are familiar with the FX3, you know that thing is a beast. It basically does not overheat in 99% of use cases. And the good news from my testing with the Lumix is it seems to be very similar. From all my testing, I could not get the Lumix to overheat at all. I run full frame internal RAW, 3+ hours using external power, and I kept formatting the memory card and going again, and I didn't even get a warning sign to say the camera was too hot. I did the same again in 6K 50 frames per second, and same result, 3+ hours with no warning sign. I tested 4K 50 and stopped at around 2.5 hours as no warning sign, and I guessed it was heading the same way. All the tests was with the screen pulled out, the default fan setting and the safety temperature setting set to high. So let's compare the noise levels. The Lumix technically has a dual native ISO of 640 and 5000, but when you factor in, you turn dynamic range boost on and it goes to one native ISO of 1000. This is kind of like a triple native ISO camera. These are all in Vlog, by the way. If you change your picture profile, this does change the native ISOs. And for anyone that does not know, on the FX3, its base ISO is 640 and it's very famous top ISO is 12,800. Starting at 3200 ISO. Honestly, I can't see a difference here. These both look super clean. Even when punching into 300%, they look almost identical in terms of noise levels, so it's an excellent result from both. Now onto 5000 ISO. Again, these both look really good for 5000 ISO. The only thing I really notice here is that maybe the Lumix is holding on to colour a little better. If you look at that bush on the left hand side, you can see it's a lot kind of greener and richer on the Lumix, where on the Sony it looks a little bit washed out. Now let's push to 12,800 ISO. This is a much darker, trickier scene for both cameras. Maybe it's a touch brighter out the gate on the Lumix if you just look at the road signs. But once we punch in maybe just slightly, the FX3 is a little bit cleaner. But I think once YouTube compression again does its thing, you guys will find it hard to tell a difference. Up to 25,000 ISO, and looking at that dark sky, you can see the Sony is like smoothing things out a little bit more, and when we punch in, it definitely looks softer on the Sony. This could be to some kind of internal noise reduction the camera is not telling you about, but it also could be that it's just a lower resolution sensor, so once again we're just seeing more detail on the Lumix. And just for fun, let's max out both of the cameras. That goes to 51,000 on the Lumix. And famously, we all know the FX3 goes up to 409,000 ISO. I'm not quite sure what to take away from this. They both look like garbage. The Sony looks a lot brighter. I'm not quite sure who shoots at these kind of ISOs, but for my shooting style, it's definitely not me. So here I set both cameras using their internal multimeters to 0. Then, using the shutter speed, adjusting to add and reduce stops of light, I captured the footage, brought it into DaVinci Resolve and recovered it the best I could. First up, 2 stops overexposed, and honestly both cameras handle this really well. The images look a bit washed out and colour shifted, but with a little more tweaking, I would say they are both totally usable. Moving on to 3 stops over, and things start to fall apart. Both cameras really struggling here. Skin tones are washed and lacking colour. The highlights aren't clipping just yet, but it's not pretty. Now let's go the other way. At 2 stops underexposed, both cameras did a solid job. There's a bit of noise creeping in, but with some noise reduction, the footage is still very usable. At -3 stops, the Lumix starts to show a green tint. While the Sony introduces a slight magenta shift, so it's not perfect, but the Sony handles this a little bit better. At -4 stops, things do get pretty wild. Nobody realistically is shooting this dark. Both cameras show heavy noise. The Lumix has a strong green cast. The Sony leans heavily into magenta. The Lumix starts also hunting for focus, while the Sony stays locked on, which is super impressive. So let's talk about ergonomics and overall packages between the 2 cameras. As we're discussing, I also have some leftover comparison shots that I'll try squeeze in and run over the top. So here in the UK, the S1 II is going to be around 20% cheaper than a brand new FX3. I'm sure that translates pretty similar globally, who knows with tariffs, but let's just assume it's going to be 20% cheaper. It's good to note though that the FX3 does come included with its top handle with 2 XLR inputs. Now to get the 2 XLR inputs on the Lumix, you have to purchase the top handle extra. That said, the Lumix one does come with 32-bit flow audio recording internally in camera, so it is a little bit better. And additionally, Lumix are going to put on a deal where if you purchase the S1 II with the new 24 260 f2.8 zoom lens, it will be half the price on the lens, which makes this even better value of a deal. I'm also currently working on a review for the 24-60mm lens, so please make sure you are subscribed. On top of that, Lumix have also announced they are now giving away 5 years warranty with all of their S series cameras. And this is a big statement because it shows the confidence they have in the build quality. I've owned and used the FX3 for a while now, and I absolutely love its body design. For my style of work, as I am video only, I do much prefer it over the hybrid style of the S1 II, as I pretty much never use an EVF. But there is one part of the S1 II's body design that would make me choose it over that design of an FX3. Simply the screen, the way it folds and flips and not just kind of flips out like the screen on the FX3. The FX3 from Sony is also marketed as a cinema camera, yet the S1 II from Lumix, a hybrid camera, has way more video features. Just to list a few of the standout features: open gate up to 50 frames per second with no crop, internal raw video, false color, external SSD recording, Bluetooth timecode sync, 32-bit flow audio capture in camera, even with the Arri Log C3 upgrade path, way better anamorphic support, waveform, there is so many. Now, Sony does have a great advantage when it comes to their overall lineup of cameras. FX6, FX9, all the way up to Burano and Venice. And they also have their really fantastic E-mount line of lenses. But E-mount lenses, from Sony at least, are extremely pricey. An L-mount system can be a lot more affordable, and Lumix lenses in general tend to be cheaper. And one thing people are not talking about enough with the L-mount ecosystem is now that Blackmagic have L-mount cameras. This really opens up and fills in the gap of where we have FX6, FX9 and Burano and Venice. We now have the Pixus and the Ursa Cine line of cameras. I can see a world where you have an A and a B cam of a Pixus and an S1 II, both capturing B-roll, and they both kind of fill in gaps where the other falls short. When I was thinking about comparing these two cameras, there is one thing that kept popping into my head, and that is if the FX3 Mark II was announced today and it was essentially what the S1 II camera is, so that 6K sensor with internal open gate capture, really great thermal management, internal raw video with ProRes options, and all of those fantastic video features like false color, anamorphic support, etc. I think the FX3 users would be over the moon and thrilled to upgrade to that camera. And all that and the S1 II release in 2025 today comes in at a cheaper price point than an FX3. I can only imagine that an FX3 Mark II is going to go up with inflation and be a lot more expensive than this. So really there is two major takeaways for me from this comparison. The first one is it really shows how ahead of the game the A7S III or FX3 was of its time of release. That camera will go down in history and continue to be an amazing camera for many more years to come. And secondly, seeing what the S1 II can do and the price point it is at, knowing the S1H2 is probably around the corner and coming soon, I think Sony really need to get the memo. They need to get over to their marketing department and start working on a release schedule for the FX3 Mark II sooner rather than later. A lot of people watching this video will remember how Sony rose to success because Canon and Nikon just refused to release cameras and waited way too long. So let's hope that Sony are not falling for the same trap they once benefited from. As for the Lumix S1 II, I've got a full review video in the works coming to the channel, so please subscribe. I'll be comparing it to the S1R2 and just digging way deep into what that thing is actually made of. In the meantime, if you want to watch how that S1R2 compares to the FX3, just like this video, click here.